It's wonderful to learn about Asia Society's very important and inspiring work over the years. And I'm truly thrilled to have this opportunity to be part of this panel. So, welcome to everyone. And today's discussion is titled Cultural Encounters: What is Colonial and What is Local? And we have a wonderful mix of prolific scholars. So I've been really looking forward to this conversation to try and explore the intersections in our scholarly engagements over the years on various aspects of South Asia. And we will be looking at different realms of South Asian interconnectedness through history while exploring what constitutes the local and colonial and understanding how these concepts are central to gauging the historical context of South Asia and extremely critical in understanding contemporary cultural, social, political dynamics. So I think that the topic for today begs the question: how were colonial cultures informed by or informed, by the local? So whether the two can be considered in isolation of each other, whether they remain distinct of one another, or do they overlap and kind of blend together? So while our work is quite diverse, there are some key concerns in the research that go back to some overarching questions, which I will put forward as we move along. So I think we can first start by looking at what really is local and colonial and how do they interact. How do we, coming from different disciplinary backgrounds, understand these terms and whether they are mutually exclusive or whether we see any kinds of intersections. And perhaps beginning with Professor Viswanathan. Gauri, I've been reading your work over the years and I'm particularly interested in your research on alternative spiritualities as a site for the interaction of the colonizer and the colonized, or between the local and the colonial for that matter. And I was going through your essay, which mentions the bridge party scene by Foster in A Passage to India, suggesting that the contact between the colonizer and the colonized was quite limited to bureaucratic transactions. And that's something that I see in my own research on Memsahibs.
I'm glad you brought up the the seminal moment in E.M. Foster's A Passage to India, where in an effort to create some kind of common space whereby the British colonial administration, along with their wives and could create some kind of social interaction with the people whom they were ruling. And for readers of E.M. Foster's novel, we all know that bridge party turned out to be totally disastrous. And the end of it was that the two parties remained as distant from each other as one could imagine, and it's the limited scope of the social interactions that made me really probe more deeply into those areas in which the British were trying to engage with Indian culture at a level where they didn't really have to interact, at a physical level. And the alternative spiritualities that you referred to, that led me to the study of, theosophy, which was a worldwide movement that found, that became, not just important to India, but it was also very important in Britain. And Theosophy's origin had to do with the incorporation of ideas drawn from Hinduism and Buddhism into this more eclectic, more syncretic form of religion, which was not really religion. It claimed to be something that transcended a divinity-centered theologies. So I'm trying to collapse a lot of material here into a few sentences. But what really interested me about these alternative spiritualities is the way that it sought to create this third space. And this is a term that is used in the introductory, in the framing remarks that are part of this panel. And this, this third space of alternative spiritualities marked both the limits of colonial knowledge and an effort to absorb local knowledge into the colonial, so that as the British got more and more interested in Hinduism and tried to appropriate selected aspects of Hinduism into something that could actually fit their own needs, Hinduism without really being Hinduism. That third space became this space of alternative spiritualities, and theosophy is one of them. Knowledge became the basis of religious history, but there's always this residual tension between, who owns this knowledge. Is it the people who are generating these understandings of occult knowledge, or is it those who are appropriating that knowledge and putting that knowledge to work for their own purposes? So much so that these whole systems of knowledge get institutionalized through the publication of various texts, through even the fields of religion. I mean, this is something that religion scholars are studying now. I have been trying to do it. I mean, I'm not a religion scholar, but I'm deeply interested in religion and trying to put it in conversation with literary studies. But there are other scholars as well. Jason Joseph Storm in his book on the myth of disenchantment. So, scholars who are trying to understand the formation of their disciplines through this process by which, local and colonial systems interact. So I'm happy to come back to that later.
So that's actually very fascinating. And in our previous conversation, you did mention how, the debate on that what is local and colonial was very hotly discussed in the 80s. And I actually went and looked at some historians who delve into local historiography, and they talked about how it was important to use local histories to kind of fill the gaps in official archives and colonial narratives. So in a way, the local becomes a way to challenge and question some assumptions which perhaps underlie the colonial. So coming to Dina, maybe I think most of us would be very curious to know how did the colonial rule specifically impact Bangladesh, and what legacies of colonialism do you observe in maybe contemporary society or the materials that you examine in your research, and perhaps a bit on how the colonial might impinge on the local, given your research on women's issues and patriarchal social institutions that I was going through the other day.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. I'm very happy to be here. It is an honor and to be in conversation with all of you. I might want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction just right now, just to set the stage for some of what I want to say, if that's okay. I don't study colonial histories or anthropologies, right? I'm very much a anthropologist of the 21st century. Yes. Right. So supply chains and transnational figurations of Muslim women and the violences enacted on their bodies. That's where I'm coming from. So it's a very different archive, if you will, that I deal with. Right. But for me, the other of the local is the global. And I would think of that as capitalist modernity, and we can call it neo-colonial capitalist modernity. But that is, so I've I come to these questions, these really important questions that you ask, from a place where I think the global and the local, both in quotes, are co-constitutive at every moment. And I'm never really looking for what is the local, not trying to pin it down. I'm not so interested in definitions. I'm interested in the kind of work that certain things called the local do, ideas of what the local or of what colonialism does, what the inheritances of colonialism do. So what colonialism does, the work that colonialism does in the world is very important to me in my own work, because it keeps coming up, because, you know, these are political categories, the local and the global or colonialism. They're not, you know, we put meaning into them depending on our locations, right? So from the, you know, I could start, I have more to say on this, just on this issue. I don't know if you want, rather than on Bangladesh. I feel like I need to, you know, set
Anything
the
at
stage.
all.
Okay, I
We're,
need to set
yeah.
the stage a little bit before I do. So just to say, you know, in the 80s, in the 90s, late 80s and 90s, I was in graduate school. South Asia was very much a Cold War concept. I'm thinking of the way in which colonialism disciplines our imagination. So I was at a South Asia center where neither Burma nor Afghanistan was included in what constituted South Asia, right? And we can end up sometimes repeating that, how colonial forms of knowledge production endure in my world, in Bangladesh, and reproduce, discipline our imaginations, our feminist imaginations and other imaginations. And I see that. I want to say that one of the things I learned as a feminist early on, as a feminist anthropologist, is to be very wary of any trying to find the meaning to categories. And I want to recall here Lata Mani's really interesting idea of what tradition, you know, how tradition is produced through the idea of modernity. I feel like, you know, putting those things in there is talking about colonialism that becomes in which we think. So one of the things I've been looking at in terms of the afterlives, you could say, of colonialism and the local is the place of Islam in this thing called South Asia, and how for a long time Islam has been a constitutive outsider to South Asia, okay? And that's and in a way, actually, you know, I was looking through my notes yesterday, and I thought Patrick Wolf, of all people, put it rather nicely that European Orientalism and Indian nationalism colluded in endorsing a principle in which Muslim decline was synonymous with Hindu Renaissance. So this is all feeding into, I think this actually gets us to the stakes of why we're even having this conversation, all these ideas of the idea of the Muslim as an outsider to India trickles into how we think about colonial legacies and genealogies in Bangladesh and the place of Islam in the making of national culture. Okay, so I can maybe leave it there, but and then talk more specifically about the Bangladesh scene, having set this up. But it seems really important to think about what the colonial categories that have been a little bit naturalized, and that my friend, for instance, Irfan Ahmed, the anthropologist, has been trying to talk about how these colonial categories are reproduced in contemporary anthropologies. And we tend to naturalize them. So we need to really think about that too. So I'll just leave it there for now.
That is actually very thought-provoking, and the perspective of Islam and the role of Islam in, or the position of Islam in the dialogues around South Asia is something that is being explored very extensively, and these are very important insights. If I can bring in Zehra, how would you say has the colonial past maybe influenced modern and contemporary South Asian art? I know we're moving from one field to another very quickly, but sort of trying to weave together everybody's research spanning so many
Yeah, so
areas. And how do you see the local and colonial coming together, or kind of diverging insofar as art is concerned, and if there is a marked delinking or some kind of continuances that you may observe in your research?
thank you for that. And it's, also to say thank you for being on this panel. It's quite overawing, actually, to see Gauri and Dina in action. So I'm a little nervous about this. So yeah, how is it relevant? Actually, I'm going to go off on a tangent because I want to really pick up a few things that Dina mentioned, and then loop backwards into the importance of the colonial local question. I've started sort of writing it down. So this connection with Orientalism and the construction of the Muslim other, totally agree that even within my research in terms of visual culture and South Asian art history, you can see those links being made. So one place that I've been really fascinated in looking for that is, because I'm based in Bristol, actually you have some amazing colonial paintings which are almost the archetype of that kind of construction. So the main one that I'm talking about is something called State Entry into Delhi. And this is painted in 1907. What it's doing is this huge, almost like panoramic mural painting that lives in on the sort of ground floor as you walk into Bristol Museum. And of course, it's presenting the British state entry into Delhi in 1903, and that evening the coronation ball happens, and the sort of the royals are represented by proxy, as it were. By the Lord and Lady Connaught, if I'm not mistaken, and you have the Curzons there as well. And the reason it's such a fascinating setup is that its style is at one level incredibly colonial. It's a kind of it's a history painting style. So it's very much that kind of the British sort of saying we are here in South Asia. But at the same time, when you look at it, you realize that it is actually in the way in which the figures operate influenced by Mughal miniature painting. And in the background of this great panorama with all the Maharajas walking behind the palanquins, you see Mughal architecture. And so what I'm trying to say is that in the way that the British construct their Indian empire, particularly with the Raj, right, is that they're actually picking up on Mughal elements in order to present themselves visually. And in that picking up of Mughal elements, what they're also doing is replacing the Mughals. So they justify their authority as the natural successors to the Mughals on the one hand, and you can see that in their visual construction of themselves. And I'm talking about a painting, but you can also talk about visual culture per se, how these processions were organized, what architecture you have in the background. So that's one thing where they're taking and replacing. But in order to replace effectively, what is the narrative that has to come in, right? The Mughals are defunct, they're useless, we've gotten rid of them. We're their natural inheritors, but also, even better, we're more natural than they are. They were invaders, and what the British can do in this dialogue is that they can play up this eternal Hindu-Indian past, and in such a way, using the symbolism of the Mughals makes the Mughals irrelevant. And so they have simultaneously used and deleted. And what I'd like to argue from Gina's point is that since you can see this in the construction of the visuals, and it's really interesting how Mughal miniature painting is actually studied even within art history. Somebody like, Mildred Archer, even, and the kind of comments that she will make. E.B. Haver really interestingly talks about how the Taj belongs to India and not to Islam. What kind of comment is that? So you have this kind of eradication of a Muslim past, even while embracing its visuality in a way that I would say is incredibly dangerous for them, and creates incredible problems. That includes a Muslim narrative, not as an invasion narrative. I'm just putting it out there. But if you look at some of Modi's election posters, not this time, but the second election, and how he stands at the Red Fort. Really, really interesting. And then just look at those pictures of how he's standing in that way at the Red Fort with it behind him. And then if you were to contrast that image with, British history paintings in how they sort of use that exact same Red Fort in the distance, as they're sort of doing their replacing thing. And it's really interesting that state entry into Delhi obviously has got it in the background as well. So I think there are huge resonances in terms of visuality, if that is what we're looking for. And, problematically, I think the colonial is connected to the South Asian local, also because of there's this sort of struggle for Muslim identity within an Indian context. And it'd be really interesting to see how that kind of, that sort of ties in with narratives also in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. And then the second thing was that I was going to quickly link into what Gauri was saying, which I thought was really fascinating, that reference to theosophy. And I wondered, the image that we've used for the poster is Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who was also like the Theosophist, part of the Brahma Samaj, and he also very much known as a reformer, and very much about that sort of connection between a British dialogue about a kind of Christian belief that helped it connect with a sort of a more Hindu structure. And I wonder if those kinds of similarities, perhaps in a pleasanter way, also lays groundwork for these kinds of collaborations in terms of different cultural spaces, but also in terms of a local, in a nice sense. Or maybe we can take it off and say it doesn't necessarily mean a nice sense, because it's a particular version of Christianity and Hinduism that also emerges. So.
Yeah, can I jump in here? Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
This is I'm very fascinated by the point that you're raising, Zehra, about this kind of intersection between, the British thoughts about Christian belief and the accommodation of certain aspects of Hinduism, because this is very much what I've been seeing in the research that I've been doing. And I have an article that's coming out very soon on which is called Theosophy as Cultural Translation. And what I've actually been doing in that article is to look at the way that Gandhi appropriated theosophy to understand Hinduism. And in fact, there are two terms that are at least two terms that are very important to me in this process, engaging colonial and local. One is appropriation. The other is mediation. And the third, there's certainly a third as well, which is translation. And translation is a pivotal aspect of that negotiation between the colonial and the local. And what I found very, very fascinating about Gandhi's understanding of Hinduism is that by his own admission, so much of it came through sources that were not immediately associated with Hinduism. I mean, we all know that he said that he read the Bhagavad Gita first in Edwin Arnold's translation in English of the Bhagavad Gita, and that the texts of Hinduism that he came to take to understand came through the Theosophical Society's publication of those texts. So everything is mediated. When it's said that Gandhi's espousal of basic Hindu concepts are what that espousal is what shaped his satyagraha movement. I think we often lose sight of the fact that even satyagraha was a very mediated concept for him. So the idea of where something begins is really what I think is totally implicated in this question of the colonial and the local. So going back to what you were saying about Ram Mohan Roy and the fact that these reform movements in Bengal, reform movements elsewhere in India, that they were made possible by just the kind of mutuality between Christian notions and Hindu notions, and that these boundaries were getting loosened as they were approaching the sites of intersection. So I think this is a very important notion, and so I want to re-emphasize how it's important to talk about appropriation, mediation, and translation, as we talk about the colonial and the local.
That's extremely interesting, actually. That makes me think of Margaret Elizabeth Noble, Sister Nivedita, and since we just started talking about Hinduism, her close association with Swami Vivekananda and the work around Ramakrishna Mission. And since Gauri, you mentioned translation, ways in which appropriations are conducted. In my research on Memsahibs, I came across Annette Beveridge, who translated Baburnama, and she was a British Orientalist who undertook translations of Mayunama and Baburnama. But coming quickly to Zehra, I just was really intrigued by when you mentioned visual culture and you talked about these paintings and the ways in which the British tried to kind of supplant the Mughal through art in a sense. I wonder if you've seen the photographs of Harriet Titler, who was a British lady in the 19th century, sometime around 1857, and she did tremendous amounts of photography across the subcontinent. And in fact, Memsahib's paintings do try to capture that what we understand as local and maybe construct what the colonial is understood as. So maybe I would like to quickly, for the sake of definitions, kind of talk about what I understand as the local and what the colonial means, and how I see that playing out in my study of Memsahib's writings, as well as my ongoing research on diseases in India in the 19th and early 20th centuries. I think that the local and the colonial and the global also, which, I will talk about later on, something that Dina mentioned and, I was immediately hooked. I think that the local and colonial kind of remain exclusive of each other, though they're not exactly distinct categories, and they inform each other in many ways. The local may perhaps be anything that was native to or originally belonging to India, something indigenous to India, India being as heterogeneous and diverse as it may be. And then colonial, as I understand it, or as I see playing out in Memsahib's writing was anything like any material or trend or culture that emerged from the experience of colonization, but also benefiting the process of colonialism in a way, and perhaps indicating a kind of hybridization or like a tension between the colonial and the local, for sure. So, for example, colonial architecture, perhaps, not neoclassical, Gothic in a sense, for those of you who might be in Delhi, the Mutiny Memorial, perhaps, but more commonly the bungalows which were inhabited by the Anglo-Indians, which were suited to the tropical landscape, and colonial recipes that the Memsahibs, write so much about, which were kind of renditions of British dishes, kind of adapted into the Indian space because you might not always get ingredients, or the cook was Indian perhaps, and maybe Indianized versions, or sort of Indian recipes that may have been changed to suit the taste of the British men and women, and colonial attire and so on and so forth. So going a little bit deeper into how the strains between the colonial and local comes out in Memsahib's epistolary writings, which I'm deeply interested in. Memsahibs, they wrote so much about their experiences of domesticity and the public space in the subcontinent. And more often than not, they, were able to influence colonial understandings of the local, and not just within the subcontinent, but also abroad. And I feel that that is very important because, they were modeling themselves on the male Orientalists in a sense. They were, for instance, in the travel writing, they were specifically trying to kind of project themselves as the male conquerors, and kind of, fashioning themselves after the male adventurers. But very importantly, they also talk about their maladaptability to the local, or their refusal or their dislike of anything that is local. And that reminds me of what Gauri was also talking about those parties and social interactions where this comes out very evidently. And I remember reading a Memsahib's diary entry in which she talked about attending a Zanana party where the ladies were present and they were in parda. But they were very uncomfortable dancing with their husbands because the Maharajas and Rajas were present there, and they felt that they were looking at them weirdly because the only context in which those men, Indian men, had seen women dancing was in the darbars as Nach girls. So, the Memsahibs, they talk about how there was often this breakdown of interactions and, communication between the colonized and the colonized, and maybe a disconnect between the local and the colonial. And I think the divides and interconnectedness are extremely important. And their Eurocentric gaze, which they cast on everything. We were talking about how everything is mediated. In the case of Memsahibs, their gaze was perhaps mediated because they were on the peripheries of the empire as women. So they had this very strange liminal position where, though their voices were mediated, because of that, they were able to give some kind of a counter discourse. So, as far as the Zanana accounts are concerned, E. Augusta King talks about how she tried to befriend a Bengali lady who wanted to learn the Roman letters, but she was not very forthcoming, and she talks about this gulf between the races. So, Memsahibs, they try to include perspectives of the local in their writings, and feminist historiographers have talked about this, but really how much of the local were they really able to capture, right, or represent in their sketches? So that remains questionable, and everything definitely gets filtered, and we see forms of operations of power and the hierarchies of race operating even when the local does get integrated into the colonial. So should we move to the next question, perhaps? How have colonial and local interactions shaped the cultural and historical narratives or literatures and art materials of South Asia. Maybe beginning with Gauri again, I was wondering, how do the information networks, which you mentioned in one of your articles, play out as far as colonial relationships are concerned, shaping the cultural and historical narratives of South Asia in connection with occult knowledge, perhaps?
I'm not going to talk so much about occult knowledge, but I will,
Sure.
focus
Okay.
on the earlier part of your remarks on information networks. And this this notion is particularly important in the work of the historian Christopher Bailey, who was very much associated with the Cambridge School of Historiography. And he had a lot of very strong remarks to make about what he called the hijacking of history writing by the Foucauldian historiography. And, in books like Information, Empire and Information, which I actually think is a fabulous, fabulous book on which I have made it, taught in some of my courses, but more specifically on the birth of the modern world, in which he theorizes this notion of information networks. Basically, Bailey's objection to the Foucauldian school of historiography is that Foucault had this very totalizing idea of state power, that it left very little agency to civil society or to the local groups that were the objects of control by state power. And Bailey was much more interested in what he called these information networks, on these associations between those who were part of the ruling classes and the whether you want to call them local communities or indigenous peoples, or that itself is another issue, and Bailey does address this. So I'm not doing justice to that part of his argument in this very brief discussion. But what he was very interested in is the ways that local elements of civil society interacted with the ruling classes and asserted their own interests, their own objectives. Mm-hmm. And what Bailey was also trying to suggest was that state power had a much more diffusionist effect. This is where he really opposed Foucault, that state power was not totalizing, was not absolute, but that it was more diffused through these networks of associations with local, particularly with local elites. And that is, I think, one of the blind spots in Bailey's work, that what he calls associations between civil society and ruling power is really what, the local elites as the significant elements from, Bailey's point of view. So he left a lot of the disempowered elements of society from his broader framework, so that something like the superstition of tribals, which he talks about in The Birth of the Modern World, he says, and he refers to the practice of Shakti by various quote unquote indigenous groups. He says that those are elements that were spurned by the international class that was more interested in the rationalizing elements of religion rather than those that had to do with superstition. And this is where I think this emphasis on occultism that I mentioned at the outset really becomes germane, because the West was just as interested in occult occultism and supernaturalism as the groups that Bailey disparages, and it's that focus that I wanted to bring to attention. So I'm going to just stop there at that point. But I think the information networks is an attempt to talk less about state power than it is about these interactions. And I think it begs the question about who's controlling the narrative. Is this a kind of camouflage? Is this diffusionist theory of state power kind of camouflage for, kind of shadow power that is actually exerting influence?
That's extremely pertinent, actually, and the bit about local LE playing a role, insofar as information networks are concerned, that is something that I also see in the histories of medicine and diseases, in the way in which perhaps when malaria epidemics occurred in Bengal and the ruling elite was the one that was perhaps resistant towards dissemination of quinine and even during other epidemics like plague and so on. But Dina, Zehra, how would you respond to this? If I can ask you to come into this conversation.
There's like a connection point that we can actually draw with this between what Dina was saying a little bit about women, and I'd like to sort of probe that, and what Gauri sort of is suggesting with these kind of rather, I guess, hybrid knowledges, even though concentrated in some ways on the local elites becoming that kind of halfway point. So first of all, like I think it's really interesting to say that these kind of knowledge systems at some level might want to present themselves as omnipotent and able to control, but that this control often breaks down. And where you can see the breaking down, I mean, this is just classic Homi Baba, right? Is that third space? It's the in between. It's that space, perhaps where the local can enter, and then you have all of these. The subaltern group, as it were, of the 80s and the 90s, kind of talking about how the local can be a counter to colonial regimes, and even in the way in which the nation is defined. One of the things that they are looking at are a sort of a history from below, as it were, which is very focused on a much more mystical idea of nation, sort of the Bhakti Sufi kind of collaboration, as it were, which is focused on the local. But again, to sort of link in with that particular subaltern studies group, who were male, many of them, kind of, and what the sort of voices that they were talking about, I just wonder where that particular kind of sort of collaborative, sort of on the ground history from below aspect of sort of as a counter to colonial narratives of dominance, even as they filter into ideas of nation in this very rational way, what the place of women is in that configuration. And specifically, I'm interested in that idea of violence to women, because it still seems to be, even within that narrative, that the figure of a woman in nation, the idea of woman as goddess, the goddess of the nation, as a very local thing that sort of unites in a very seductive way, rather than a rationalist construction. That still depends on the body of woman, right? So either which way, what do you do if you're claiming a national space? So ultimately, always inscribing that on the body of the woman. And I wonder whether that in itself is a bit of a problem, because that its inscription can be one as sort of worshipping her as mother, or it can be as raping her, which is exactly what happens with partition violence, right? And I wondered if there's a kind of connection there that Dina might.
Yeah, I just want to jump in for 1 minute. Gosh, there's so much. I really liked, I'll talk about the women in just 1 minute. I really like this idea of everything always being mediated. But of course, the question is, what are the conditions of mediation and how unequal are they? And this is sort of how I was thinking about mediation is it's not in the context of, let me just talk about women. It's very interesting that the figure of the woman and nation in colonial India and the figure of the goddess is a Hindu goddess. So it ends up having a lot of exclusionary effects that then end up in contemporary Bangladesh being, causing all kinds of problems within the nation state about how to think of the nation, not just as a gendered thing, but just the nation as how to think about the nation and religion and the relationship between nation and religion. And not to go on too much about this, but Bengali speaking Muslims or the category of Muslim Bengali is a very awkward category because you are never Muslim enough in the racialized logic of East Pakistanis, for instance, and you're never Bengali enough in the upper caste Hindu logic of Bengali speakers, right? So this in-betweenness has shaped a much of nationalist contestations in Bangladesh. And the figure of the woman has been very critical in trying to mediate these differences, and it's come through the figure of the woman wearing a sari and wearing a bindi, and that marks secularism. It doesn't mark Hinduism. It marks a kind of secularism. And that figure has been very important in nationalist rhetoric. Bangladesh's national anthem, which is Amar Sonar Bangla, written by Tagore, actually, it doesn't have the last few verses which really talks about goddess. It's very interesting. A lot of stuff is left out in order to accommodate the not goddessness of the land, which is the mother, right? But now what you have is claiming these figurations of women in the contemporary world that I see are not about middle-class women, because we are now we've inherited this actually very much colonial liberal logic of lifting the nation up through lifting its women, but it's the laboring body that is very central to the nation. That laboring body must be empowered because the elite women are already empowered is the assumption there. And this is where the elite as sort of gatekeepers comes in. And if you do any kind of field work on feminist human rights, there will be the elite gatekeepers with their particular vision of a very colonial developmentalist logic of what's happening. But people on the ground, so to speak, have a very different readings of what's going on, very much more what we might call resistance that's there. So I think also Bangladesh is a very different space in that sense, but the battles over secularism and religion are still being fought over women's bodies, not in the same way through the 47 rape narrative and community narrative, but in a different way over sartorial practices.
Mm-hmm. And the whole sort of the class the class dynamic that has suddenly entered the conversation. I wonder if you could say something maybe about that particular definition of elite and the way I find it quite interesting that the British, whether they admit it or not, somebody like David Cannadine talks about it, very contentious figure, his ornamentalism. They sort of have in themselves sort of absorbed a class structure that is actually a mirror image of a particular kind of caste structure. And I find it fascinating what you say about Bangladesh and that sort of perhaps the image of the nation as it's first built, which you see in the visual arts, somebody like Zainal Abidin, for instance, is built on the laboring body, but then it sort of morphs into how do you also handle this idea of an elite that has to be I guess, handled in order to create a particular kind of legitimacy. And I had no idea that this is actually worked out in the way that you're saying on the body of the woman.
A lot of it is so there. I mean, in art, actually, there's a very middle class folk imagination. I mean, Zainul Abidin doesn't do it as much as Kamral Chaudhry, several other people, but there is the iconic woman, idea of the woman who has never labored. And then there are the laboring bodies in real life too, today. I mean, that's that's what you see, not shown in art today either, particularly.
One of the interesting things that I'm sorry, Zehra, yeah. Go ahead if you want.
No, you go ahead.
No. I just wanted to just a very quick point, but I think it's really interesting, Dina, that when we're talking about the goddess, how there is this kind of transition from the sphere of religion to the sphere of culture. So that when we try to understand how contemporary forms today may have derived from what are the antecedents of the contemporary forms. Right. It is so interesting to see these kinds of transitions from something that originated in the religious context, but has morphed into to the cultural, i.e. the secular. So I think the example that you had given about the goddess, becoming, not associated with Hinduism so much through the sartorial aspect, through culture. And I think that's something that we might see in so many aspects of contemporary Indian society, that something that we, see as a kind of cultural practice or a cultural phenomenon, that when we try to reverse engineer, that contemporary form, that we find its origins, perhaps in the religious, but how that's more or less effaced in the contemporary versions.
Gauri, I'm really interested with that because I want to ask, how effaced is it? Or is our problem the fact that the effacing hasn't ever really happened? So it's partial. It's certainly very important for us who belong to a kind of liberal left, as it were, a left that isn't into a hyper-nationalist dialogue, that we see this. And these are sort of cultural national symbols. But, it takes a particular kind of resonance for granted. So it's very easily reverted back into religious context, right? So why does the BJP and Modi want to say, Mother Goddess? And, why? Because, and it's so easy then. And that's, so I wonder, quick, that...
Well, offense is the sign that it hasn't been effaced. That's the point. That's the point of departure for the recognition of that it hasn't been effaced, that it is residual. And then we can talk about blasphemy, and we can talk about all of that coming out of.
It's true, but also there is, I think, if you're thinking about Bangladesh or going back, there is a way in which certain forms get naturalized as cultural, but it's about majoritarian cultural. So I think one needs to be a little bit careful about that, to what gets naturalized and becomes cultural, and what is continues to be marked as religion. Just throwing that in there, I see what you're saying. So and it's constantly going back in Bangladesh. The teep has apparently now also suddenly become a Hindu thing once more, like an Indian thing. So it's constantly going back and forth. Yes, offense, not so much. It's not blasphemous. It's just considered to be now Hindu culture, and its meaning keeps changing, which is really interesting. It's never fully effaced, as you say. Right. But but I think in India, what I see certainly is what is considered to be cultural can be what to me might very often, to my eyes, might just look as Hindu. To me, it's become naturalized in India.